Morning. Oh, I love that. People are like, oh, look, the old guy's back. It's so good to be back with you here. I usually sit out where you're sitting, but to have a chance to share the word. I mean, do you realize it has almost been exactly a year since I retired? At the earliest service, a buddy of mine was there, and he starts clapping right at that point. Whoa! I wasn't sure how to take that, actually. But as I reflect back on the time, the year, it's been tremendous. People tend to ask me the same questions. How's your golf game? Oh, I'm struggling. I still have problems with the clown and the windmill. That'll come to you. Give it a minute. People say, oh, how are the kids? And some of you knew my daughter, well, you've known my daughter since she was 9 years old. She married a wonderful gentleman. His name is Owen Hardy on the last Saturday of April. And I had the privilege of celebrating that marriage, and it was awesome. And our son and daughter-in-law, Stephen and Angelina, of course, they have blessed us with Jackson James, my grandson, who is an absolute rascal, and I love him more than life. And I've got to tell you, a word to the dads. When I was younger and my children were very young, I was working so hard and so long, I missed significant opportunities. But now that I'm retired, my son's son, I am able to give him time, love, and affection, and it's a blessing. People say, how's Marianne handling your retirement? She loves it. I'm not joking. She loves it. Because frankly, I didn't do much at home before retirement, and she has me doing a lot now. We cook together, and I love that. We're making great things and having great time, and just enjoying life and feeling extraordinarily blessed. But one of the greatest joys is to be here. To sit each week in the back, usually at the 9 o'clock service, to listen to the awesome worship, to hear Ryan's fantastic preaching, and to be a part of a church that is so loving and gracious and growing, vibrant and alive. And I was here last Sunday and listening to Ryan as he went through the data and the stats, and they are so impressive. And everybody focuses on worship attendance and giving. That tends to be the key factors that people focus on. Not for me. I mean, those are leading indicators, and believe me, they are important and crucial. But when he shared the information about the number of you who are involved in small groups, community, the number of you who are involved in service and mission, the number of you who are invested in our prayer ministry, the number of you that are actually growing not only in faith and grace, but inviting, it stirred my soul. And I am so, let me tell you, to have been a pastor here and served for over 20 years and poured out my life, my blood, sweat, and tears, my heart and soul for this church, something would have to be seriously wrong for me to actually be unhappy that things are going incredibly well. The greatest joy of my life right now is seeing the amazing, awesome ministry. And it's such a privilege to sit here with you or to stand here. I'm just waiting for a piece of confetti to flutter down. But the greatest joy for me is the number of people I see in this last year that I've never seen before. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. We're in this preaching series, and it's an exciting series. Ryan led off last week, and I'm privileged, I'm blessed to jump in and talk about one of the 5 practices, inviting. Because I'm convinced that an invitational attitude toward other people is dependent on the spiritual perspective we bring on the world at large. Now let me ask you a question, and I'll preface it by saying that in 45 years of ministry, I've never been political in my preaching, and I'm certainly not going to start now. But I'm going to ask you a question, and it may sound political, it's not, it's cultural. That's why I want you to just think and ponder your response. Here's the scenario. Two people are sitting down to have a conversation. Maybe it's across the Thanksgiving table, maybe it's across the kitchen table, maybe it's at the local library, or maybe it's a book club, maybe it's at school, maybe it's at the bar, the tavern that people go to. And one is a Democrat and one is a Republican. Ooh, let's push that a little farther. One is an AOC Democrat and the other is a MAGA Republican. Are you with me? Do you know what I'm talking about? Does that all make sense? Imagine that they sat down and talked politics. How do you suppose that would go? Ooh, your groan speaks volumes. But let's add another layer, another dimension. Would it make any difference if one or both were Christian? Would it make any difference in the tone and tenor of the conversation that transpires? The hopeful one within me says, yes! The somewhat frustrated one in me says, I don't know. Because you see, our culture has become so poisonous. We've fallen in love with hating our enemies. And we have become so divisive, and there's such deep-seated enmity and animosity toward people who see the world and experience life differently than we do. Across all dimensions, there's no sense of tolerance, of appreciation, no seeking of understanding, and that's toxic. Because what that does is it feeds the hatred, it seeds the divisions, and it actually begins to poison the relationship in such a way that we dehumanize. We look at others as people who not only disagree with us, we look at them with disdain and disgust. And it's so prevalent in our culture, you got to ask, is it different in the church? Because the real question here is our attitude toward others Christ-like? Oh, and that takes us together to one of the greatest chapters in Scripture. And here's what I love about this entire chapter. It reveals the heart of Christ. And it entails a story that we all think we know. And the irony is, everyone who heard it for the first time thought they knew the story. And I don't think any of us have it fully figured out yet, which is so engaging. It draws you into the text. And that's exactly what I want to do with you today. Come on, I'm going to take you to Luke chapter 15, a great, great chapter written by the physician Luke that describes an encounter Jesus had with the Pharisees. Let me put it in context. Jesus is actually dining with sinners, with tax collectors, prostitutes, the very outcasts of first century Judea. He's dining with them. And you may not understand or fully fathom how offensive that was to the Pharisees. Remember, the Pharisees were the people who were the legalists of the age. They believed that you needed to follow the law in order to draw close to God. And if you violated the law, then God condemned you and God abhorred you. And their perspective was that people who were considered unclean, who violated the law, they were worthless. Worthless. And they treated them exactly that way. And so Jesus is dining with tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees are ticked off. They are angry. And so Jesus, as was his usual approach, told 3 stories. And all of them are great stories. First story is really simple. A guy had a bunch of sheep, and he lost one. So he left the others, and he chased after the sheep, and he found him. And when he found that lamb and brought it home, everybody rejoiced, and they were glad because what was lost was found. Simple story. You get that, right? The only real insight there that's a little uncomfortable is he's clearly comparing us to sheep. That's not exactly complimentary. Are you with me? But the Pharisees, they weren't with Jesus. They still didn't get it. So he told another story. An even better story. He told of a woman who had 10 silver coins. Now, these weren't just coins in her purse. When a woman married, she received a headgear that actually had 10 silver coins that were representative of her betrothal and marriage. Make sense? So when she loses a coin, it's not like losing a dime, a quarter, a silver dollar, whatever. No, it's like losing your wedding ring. Oh, I get it now. And when Jesus said she searched the whole house, threw as much light as she could, and when she found it, she rejoiced and told all of her friends about it. Now you get it, because some of you have lost your wedding rings, haven't you? And experienced that horror, that fear, that sense of loss. But the Pharisees still didn't get it, so Jesus comes to the climax of the text, and this is what he brings home to us. He tells the story of the prodigal sons. Now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put the text up. I'm going to read part of it. I'm going to paraphrase. Remember paraphrase by pricing? We used to do that. Vintage is in, so that's okay. We're going to do paraphrase, and we're going to explore the story and see what the people thought then and what people are thinking now about this text. Because I'm not sure any of us fully understand it. Let me show you. Let's go to the text. We're in Luke chapter 15, and we pick up the thread in verse 11. And Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. Oh, that's a good translation of the original Greek, but it doesn't come close to the original meaning. Some of you are parents, right? Some of you aren't sure. Stay with me. Some of you are parents, right? Yes. Some of you are parents of adult children, yes? Well, imagine this, a son or a daughter coming to you and saying, having the audacity to say to you, Dad, Mom, I know, everything's going to be mine one day when you're dead. But I don't want to wait. I want it now. How would you feel about that? Yeah, that's pretty much how the crowd felt in the first century. How offensive. What an ungrateful little brat. Seriously, regardless of how old they were. I mean, the crowd was ticked off, and that's exactly the emotion Jesus intended to engender. They all thought that the father would say, no, are you crazy? How offensive, get out of my house. The father did the opposite. Because you see, God always gives. It's the very heart of the gospel. For God so loved, he gave. That is the gospel. And the father divides his wealth between his 2 sons, the older and the younger, and he gives the resources to his younger son, and look what happens. The younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey to a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. Now stop. None of this is surprising. 2,000 years later, it's no different. Look at the few people who win the lottery and have anything to show for it 10 years later. Look at the professional athletes who are at the height of the profession and the income standings and have nothing to show for it 20 years later. People squander what's entrusted to them, and that's what this ungrateful guy did. But then his life took a really hard turn. A severe famine arose in the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. This is where people really are rocked back on their heels. Because this son who was so ungrateful and demanded his inheritance before his father was dead, this son who went and squandered a fortune is now consigned to feeding pigs. Nothing could be more offensive to a Jewish listener in the first century. And that's when the son has an epiphany, an insight, a word from God, if you will. But when he came to himself, I love that. That presumes that we're aware that there's a space in our souls, in our hearts and minds and spirits that's shaped exclusively by and for God. And we try to stuff everything else imaginable into that space, and nothing satisfies, which is why our culture is so ridden with addiction. And people have become addicted to so many different things because all of us are looking for something. We're looking for that satisfaction, that contentment, that sense of peace and serenity that says, I'm loved by God and I'm forgiven for the past. But only God can fill that. No drink, no pornography, nor drug, no accumulation or acquiring of anything can ever fill the void other than God. And you see, the son figured that out. When he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, now listen, he writes the speech. How many of you have gotten in trouble and written the speech? You know that speech? It's when you're ashamed and embarrassed and you've really screwed up royally, and you write the speech to deliver to your mom, your dad, your boss, you fill in the blank. And this is the speech he wrote. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. Now let's pause, time out. Because most of you have heard this story already, right? Right? Most of you have an inkling how it ends, right? And you're pretty confident in that, right? So were the people in the first century. James Emery Wright is a brilliant author. He's a former seminary professor, seminary president, and now he serves at church, Mecklenburg. And he's an insightful man. And he's always doing historical research. And along with his writing, he does a podcast. And yes, I still listen to church podcasts. And he did one within the last year, and he talked about this story and shared a dimension that I had not heard before. He pointed out that there was an ancient story of the time before the time of Jesus that in all probability was known by the listeners to this story, and it runs very parallel and very similar to the story that Jesus told, which is not an accident. The ancient story is really simple. There was a wealthy father, who had a son. The son fell in with the wrong crowd. You're familiar with that concept. He fell in with thieves and robbers who didn't value things or people. And they conspired together to rob a wealthy man, the wealthy man being the father of the son. And they broke into his house and stole his value, because remember, in the first century they didn't have banks. And they fled into the night, and only one was caught. And who would it be? The son. And what did he do? He begged his father for forgiveness. And the father embraced him and said he welcomed him back and forgave him, and told the son that he would have a feast, a celebration, to celebrate his restoration. And at the feast, when all had gathered, when the calf had been slaughtered and slow roasted, and the aromas of the feast swept through the room, the father stood and looked at his son and raised a glass to his son. And when the son drank of it, he collapsed and died because his father had poisoned him. Oh, well, that changes everything. Don't you see? Because if that's what the people then were expecting, what Jesus delivered was the direct opposite. They were expecting the Pharisees, who saw with condemning eyes those who were far from God. And Jesus revealed a Father that is entirely 180 degrees diametrically opposed to that Father in the ancient story. How does it go? Let me read the text. Let me offer an editorial as I go. But while he was still a long way away off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced and kissed him. Now let's stop right there. This is the Middle Eastern culture. It's no surprise that he embraced and kissed the son. That's common. That is the cultural affection and intimacy, even among men. Years and years ago, we had a gentleman who was a part of our church when we were downtown Lee Summit. His name was Tony, and he was Iraqi. In fact, he had been a fighter pilot in the Shah's Air Force, and when the Shah fell, he fled to the United States and ended up at our church. And he loved our church. He was a fascinating fellow. And he would come in, and he treated me with such respect, even reverence. Called me pastor. He would walk in and see me, and he'd go, "Pastor." He'd open wide his arms, take me in an embrace, and he'd kiss me on both cheeks. Don't you try that. Okay? Are we good? Because he was Iraqi and you're not, okay? So guys, don't be coming up to steal a kiss from me. But Tony, it was different. He meant it with such respect and appreciation and honor. And because of his actions, I understand the Father in the story. But what I don't understand is the Father picked up his robes and ran. You got to understand, in the first century, men don't run, ever. It's considered dishonoring, self-denigrating. I mean, children run, men don't. And I want you to know, I am biblical in my perspective on men running. I haven't run in years, and it shows. And it's okay. I'm good with that. But the Father ran, and why? Because in that expression of love and compassion, he distracted the entire community from the sins of the Son and drew them on himself and bore the onerous approbation of the community because he did what was considered self-dishonoring. And then he said to his Son, the Son starts his speech that he had prepared. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the Father, now what's not injected here is the Father interrupted him. But the Father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. And most importantly, most poignantly, the Father did not poison and kill his Son. He loved him. And there is the revelation of God's love for the world, especially those who are far from him. It reveals the attitude of a loving, gracious, forgiving Father. It shows us that for God, all people, even those far from him, are precious to his heart. What about you? I read the stats. I see what people write, think. We're living in the culture of nuns, and I don't mean the Catholic order that wear the habits. We're living in a culture of nuns. Atheism, for instance, the number of atheism. I hear people in other churches speak with such disdain and disgust about atheists, as if they were enemies or antagonists. And yet, when you do some research, you discover that 25% of atheists believe in a higher power. What? Atheists who don't believe in God, 25% of them believe in a higher power. Richard Dawkins, who is a famous atheist, describes himself now as a cultural Christian. You can look this up. It was a news blast. He believes that the world is a better place because of the Christian church, and he happens to love the hymns and carols and anthems of the faith and believe it has positively impacted the world. You know what I hear in that atheism? An opportunity. A number of people describe themselves as agnostic. That means they cannot know and won't know if there's a God or not, and yet 70% of them pray. What? Think of that. People who aren't sure there's a God, and yet there's enough spiritual awareness that they are praying to a God they don't know or understand. And the nuns, that doesn't mean they have no faith, it means they have no church. And so how would God treat them? And how should we then in turn? Well, Paul is the best biblical example. In Acts 17, he goes to Athens, and this is what happens. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you in Jesus Christ." Don't you see? People look at the world and think it's lost. I look at the world today and I see a world of opportunity for you and for me to make a difference in the world. You've come to this church because you found here something significant, a place that touches your heart and feeds your soul and encourages your spirit. You've learned to follow Jesus and find life, and that life is good, and we are blessed. But there's a world that is hurting and longing to discover what you are in the midst of finding. A Jesus that's worth following, a Jesus that actually brings great blessing, peace, serenity, and joy, that space that only God can fill. I love what Jennifer said. Jennifer and Luis are just two of the sweetest souls you will ever meet. And she talked about the struggles. And I just want to give you very quickly, 5 quick takeaways about how to invite somebody to be part of what you've discovered. First of all, if you're going to be inviting the world to come to the Summit Church and discover what we have discovered, it really starts with this. It starts with prayer. Because when you pray to God, He opens your eyes and your heart to what you would otherwise not see. People say, well, how does God talk? And how do you even know it's God? If it's consistent with Scripture, and it has to be consistent with Scripture, if it actually is a blessing to you, to others, and perhaps to you, and if it costs you something, it's probably of God. Does that make sense? You with me? And I believe that when you pray and pray to God, God, show me who you would have me invite to be a part of the community of faith that I love. I believe He'll plant seeds of thought in your heart and mind. And God, most often for me, doesn't speak in a voice, an audible voice, but in a whisper of a thought that comes to my heart and mind that's not of me and pushes me beyond the comfort zone, like inviting someone. It continues with prayer that leads to an anticipation and expectation of hesitancy or refusal. I don't know if you've noticed, but Christians have given Christianity a bad name. Have you noticed that? And you're overcoming all of those objections when you invite someone to church. It's worth it. Expect the hesitancy, but be positive and be persistent, because it's the only way we will make a difference in the world, by being loving and gracious and persistently so. And it's not up to us ultimately, it's up to God. Because God touches hearts through us, through a simple invitation to people who will hear it from no one other than you, and brings them closer to Him. And He loves them just as He loves you. You know the best part of what I heard in Ryan's sermon last week? When he was going through and sharing the data and shared with us that in this year there have been 626 first-time visitors in our church. That blew me away. Because here's what I know. Most first-time visitors won't give you their name because they're afraid of what you might do with it, seriously. And we never abuse that. We actually treat that with the utmost respect and give people space. But 626 people are here for the first time because someone like you invited them to come to some place like this. And I can tell you, I know it's true. Because I come to church each week with my wife, and I look and see people I have never seen before. And each time I do, I thank God, and I thank you, because you are and are becoming an inviting church, because the 5 practices matter. And I thank God for you. Will you pray with me, please?